Hey everybody, it's Dr. Behl here again. It's casual Mondays for me. It's President's Day, so obviously I celebrate. I wanted to just reach out real quick and talk to you guys about. I'm getting some pretty persistent emails here about some issues that people are having in class that I wanted to talk to you about. First of all, you guys overwhelmingly are doing a pretty good job of keeping up with everything, turning in assignments on time, and so I really appreciate that. This really is and should be a um, a really self-driven class. And overwhelmingly, like I said, you guys are doing very well. One thing that I think will be very helpful that I haven't mentioned to you yet, I'm pulling up the rubric here and I'm about to share my screen with you, is to review the rubric for the final paper, because everything in this class kind of builds on itself. And so the outline is supposed to be the outline for your final paper. The intro and lit review should be more or less the intro and lit review that you're going to use, or at least a draft of the intro and lit review you're going to use for your final paper. On a lot of people's outlines, it seemed as though people had no idea what this paper was supposed to look like, no idea what sections were necessary in the paper. And so I just kind of want to go over that with you today and then also dive into what those papers should look like. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And pull up the peer review template here, okay? So this is basically kind of the final rubric for your paper. Also, you'll be asked to use this template when you guys do your peer reviews later on, right? One thing I do, well, we'll talk about that later. So the first thing is your research topic choice. You need to have a clearly defined research question that needs addressing, and you have to identify why it's important. More or less, you guys kind of did that in your first assignment, at least the first half of that. The whole crux of the paper is making an argument that this research question matters. So the structure of the paper should have the following sections. I'm on section 2 now in the content areas. There should be an introduction. There should be a literature review, and you should have clear hypotheses for whatever your research project is. There should be a methods section and an implications section. C and D, methods and implications, are the main places that people didn't include anything in their outlines, and they just kind of blew that off. But if you notice, that's half the paper, right? So everyone is very concerned a 15-page paper, or a 10 to 15-page paper, or whatever it is that you guys write, is a decently long paper. And people are picking topics that are so broad that they're saying, oh, I need to fill up 15 pages. How do I fill up 15 pages? Remember, your methods section is going to be a good 7 or 8 pages. And so on the outline, if you just had methods, that's not really good enough, right? Because what are your research methods? You need to be thinking that through, because you should structure your lit review to support not only your research question, but also your research methodology. And then the paper content. There should be a clear research story being told, a clear argument made. Your literature review should not just be literature summaries, but they should make an argument. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. And then also explain why the topic is important, what the question is, and what you hope to answer. Everything else here under paper structure, under this last final 4, or this section 4, is fairly self-explanatory. APA citations when appropriate with at least 10 sources, punctuation and grammar, 15 full pages in length. That means start on line 1 on whatever, you have a title page. On page 2, you start on line 1 and you fill it up to the bottom of page 16. And then this rubric is attached to the back of the paper. Don't worry about that since this is electronic formatting. I'm just giving everyone 5 points. So even if you don't turn anything in, but a title page, you'll get 5 points with that section. I'm not encouraging you not to do that. Okay, please, for the love of God, turn in a real paper. 5 points will make you fail this class, but don't worry about attaching the rubric to the back. So the question really is, for this intro and lit review, and specifically this clear research story and lit review sections under the paper content, what does that mean, and what am I hoping to accomplish from that? I'm going to stop sharing my, actually, I'm not yet. Before I stop sharing my screen with you, under modules, you will see that there is a paper that's posted. If you scroll down to, he couldn't have done it, he was with me, under the research methods lectures section. This is a paper written by a friend of mine, Heather Price. And the reason I have this is because it's a very short paper. The whole paper is only 7 pages. You guys should structure your paper like this. I just didn't want to assign you a 35-page paper to read, so this was only 7, so your paper obviously should be longer. But Heather here does a beautiful, beautiful job of painting a research story and synthesizing the literature. Now, one thing to remember before I'm going to full screen this now, but before I really go into detail here, one thing to remember is this is a research proposal. that you're writing. This is not, you are not collecting data. You are not going out in the world and doing interviews. You should not have a results section. Notice it in the rubric, it was intro, lit review, methods, implications. You are not collecting anything. So if you have a results section in your paper, I know that something has gone wrong because that's weird. So with that being said, what you guys are doing in this paper is suggesting, here's an area that needs to be researched, here's why it needs to be researched, and here's how I propose we research it. The kind of intellectual idea behind this and the practice for you guys is, for those of you who are going to graduate school in any capacity, you'll have to write a master's thesis. This paper could be the launching point for your master's thesis. I actually got an email from a student this week, well, or last week, I guess at this point, that she is doing her research paper topic from Senior Seminary Research Methods as her master's thesis, and she's applying to PhD programs and is hoping to use it for her dissertation as well, an extension of it for her dissertation. So take this seriously now, and you can use it in the future. So what's going on here? Well, Heather and Laura, I don't want to ignore Laura here. I don't know her, though, like I know Heather, are writing a paper, right? He could have done it. He was with me, a kind of fun, catchy title, The Impact of Alibi, Witness, Age, and Relationship. So already straight out of the gate, we know what this paper is about is the willingness of an alibi, or the impact, how jurors or somebody perceives the alibi, witness, age, and the relationship to the suspect, presumably in terms of believability. I've read this paper 100 times, so I obviously know that that's exactly what it is. But the title even is telling you what the paper is about, right? How does the alibi's age and relationship to the defendant affect its believability? Now, how does Heather start off this paper? And again, this whole paper is only 7 pages, and so she does this in a very condensed manner, but she's got 2 paragraphs here right at the beginning. This is basically the introduction. And all papers, all academic papers are structured kind of like a martini glass, right? It starts off broad and gets narrower and narrower and narrower until the only possible conclusion to this whole argument you're making in the lit review is your research question. This research question then goes into the method section and how you're going to study it. That's the stem of the martini glass, right? We're saying very, very focused on how are we going to address a specific theme. And then at the end, we go broad again pretty quickly. And that's kind of the base of a martini glass. In fact, you know what? Coincidentally, I've got a martini glass right here, right? And so we're going to start broad here and see how Heather narrows it down and gets to the stem and then shoots it back out. Now, granted, Heather collected data here, but this is the basic shape that we're looking for. So I'm not going to read this whole paper to you, but you can see to date there have been 280 post-conviction exonerations in the United States. These cases have allowed us to gain a better understanding. The role of alibis in wrongful conviction cases has recently become of interest to researchers. Presumably, these exonerees had an alibi for their whereabouts at the time of the crime. Exploring variables that may contribute to the believability of an alibi is the focus of this present work. So boom, she hits you right with it. She starts off broad there, right? There have been 280 people that have been convicted for crimes that we know they didn't actually commit, right? So because of that, we need to figure out what are some of the causes of these wrongful convictions. Well, the role of alibis has become of recent interest. Maybe alibi corroboration has something to do with this. Presumably, right, the exonerees had an alibi. All right, so we're clearly showing, we're starting broad, wrongful convictions, we're going to go to alibis. Exploring variables that may contribute to the believability of an alibi is the focus of the present work. So now we want to know, what is it about alibis that might make them more or less believable? Now, that's still pretty broad because the believability of an alibi could be 100 different things. We're still kind of up in this part of the martini glass, right? And so a factor that affects the believability of an alibi is whether or not the suspect or defendant can provide support for the alibi through physical evidence or through person evidence. So again, we know that this paper is about age and the relationship. What in the world does physical versus person evidence do? We're getting more and more narrow. What affects believability? Well, there's physical evidence and person evidence. So when the alibi is supported through a person evidence, police and jurors likely take the alibi-witness relationship of the suspect into account. So now we're setting aside the physical evidence. We're getting more specific to person evidence, right? And so we're starting again, we're still moving down the glass. Previous research, blah, blah, blah. That is, certain family members may be viewed as credible. So now we're talking about the different relationships between person evidence. There's family members and not family members. So we see that relationship element, right? Maybe more credible than stranger alibi witnesses, right? And then it ends here, right? So we've got age also. She talks about age up here somewhere. A familiar witness. We know a little about variability. Maybe she doesn't actually mention age here yet, but we're still getting closer and closer down a familiar witness versus an unfamiliar witness. And we're getting closer and closer to the research question. And then we kind of see at the intro, we get a glimpse, a preview of what is this paper really about. In the current research, we explore the perceived credibility of an alibi provided by one family member who a suspect would presumably spend a large amount of time with the suspect's child. So now we are introduced to this concept of age also. So we're seeing a relationship, a child versus a stranger, and then potentially, right, with children as alibi witnesses, and we go through this section, they're going to introduce this idea of, is the child young or is the child older? So we've got this beautiful overview. This section, I'm hoping you can see my cursor on the screen. I'll highlight it if you can't. This section is a beautiful intro of, we're starting broad and we're getting narrower and narrower and narrower. Now, she's introduced a bunch of things here though, right? We need to talk about the fact that how are children viewed as witnesses, right? We have this idea of children. So children as alibi witnesses. What is the kind of ideas about children as alibi witnesses? We also have the relationship between the alibi witness and the suspect, right? And so going back to even the title, witness, age, and relationship. Age, children, right? And then relationship, the relationship between the alibi, right? I guess that's the same word, and we'll get to investigator paradigms in a minute. So in this whole section, I'm not going to read it out to you, but you'll see where she again starts broad and kind of narrows down, getting us closer and closer to her research question, right? Where she starts again, what is the effect of children as witnesses, right? Children's perceived credibility as witnesses. It gets down to the point that children's credibility has been conceptualized as following two dimensions, blah, blah, blah. However, it is reasonable to anticipate that cognitive ability, particularly with regard to specific times, dates, and locations, may be especially important in the provision of an alibi and thus diminish a child's perceived credibility. So we still have a question here, right? We're still not really sure. It could be that children are viewed as really credible because they don't really even understand why they would have a motivation to lie. However, there's also the possibility that children don't really know anything that's going on, right? And they're not familiar with the times and dates. They don't really remember what day anything happened, right? And so their credibility might be low. So already, the red flags are going off here. Oh, I see where this is going. She wants to know, are children perceived as more credible or less credible alibi witnesses? That makes sense. Now, the relationship between alibi and suspect, we're going to zoom back out a little bit, but not too terribly far, right? Previous research has found that an alibi witness's relationship to the suspect plays a substantial role in the believability of that alibi. So zooming back out, well, wait a minute. We've already talked about age and children may or may not be more credible. Now, what if it's a child of the suspect versus just another kid? Is there something that happens when the witness is related to the person versus if it's like my next door neighbor or my former next door neighbor Jameson, who's 6 years old, who's my buddy, right? Is he going to be more credible than if I had a child of my own? And it works its way down to the very last. Overall, it is our expectation that children will be seen as a more credible alibi witness than adults, perhaps even to the point that a related child witness will be perceived as more credible than a non-familial adult. Now, granted, this is kind of their hypotheses, but right. For relational alibi witnesses, honesty may be more salient than accuracy. You're seeing how they're really narrowing it down to where we're getting to the kind of crux of the research question, which is basically, is a child more credible than an adult? Is a relative more credible than a stranger? And then how do those interact with each other? Is a child stranger the most credible? Is a child relative the most credible? Is a child relative the same credibility as an adult stranger? How do these relationships kind of play out in the world? Then we jump into investigator paradigms. Now, this is a unique section that you guys don't necessarily need, but it could be pretty helpful. Here, Laura and Heather kind of go into detail for a little bit, not too terribly far, into how are they going to go about testing it and what is the argument for testing it this way. And they kind of go into kind of some research methodology. Sometimes, depending on your research project, you'll have to justify the research methodology in some capacity. Here's how other people have tested similar things. And so we think that we should test it that same way, or here's where those methods that other people use are a little lacking and we're trying to make them better. And that's basically what you see here in this section. And then they justify what they're kind of justify an argument about how they're going to um, do the study, and then boom, it jumps straight into the study. Now, the difference between this paper and what you're doing is this paper is past tense, right? 124 students between the ages of 18 participated, past tense, individually in return for bonus. In your study, you might say 150 participants will participate in this project, right? And that's important because you're just proposing, hang on, I've got to get this thing off the screen. There we go. You're just proposing to do this. You're not actually collecting anything. So make sure your method section is in future tense. So who are you studying? It doesn't matter who your group is. Your group could be anybody in the world, right? Some people are doing stuff on sex trafficking. Some people are doing research on shoplifting. Some people are doing research on juvenile justice, right? Who are you proposing to study and where are they? What kind of special considerations do you need, right? For example, if you want to do a study on sex trafficking victims, how are you going to find sex trafficking victims? I mean, it's pretty difficult to find a protected group like that. So you need to come up with ways that are you going to work with a domestic violence shelter? Are you going to try and just find police reports that mention sex trafficking, which is going to be very difficult because most of those reports are kind of sanitized to protect victims' identities, right? Then materials and procedures. What are you going to do? If you're doing an eyewitness study, how is your lineup going to be structured? Is it going to be in person? Is it going to be on a piece of paper? Is it going to be one at a time? Is it going to be a group of people? If it's a survey, how is the survey going to be presented? For every survey, and this is where your method section is actually going to be fairly long, every question you plan on asking in the survey should be present in this proposal so that I know every single thing they're being asked to do. The procedure also matters. The participants are first given a mock police file that described a robbery and an eyewitness description of a 50-year-old culprit. The description of the crime was based on a 3-minute crime video, blah, blah, blah. The participants were given instructions for using a computer database for the suspect. Again, you can read all this and see, but it literally takes you step by step, like a recipe in a cookbook, of exactly what to do. The method section is kind of the ingredients. And I guess the participants and materials are the ingredients. The procedure is quite literally the actual recipe of take the flour, dump it into a bowl, add eggs, stir, right? We need that level of detail. I should not wonder, how in the world do they get to here? It should be very clear. This is all the stem of the martini glass. It's hyper-focused on just one topic, right? And so by the end of this, right after the participants saw the video, they again read the probabilities to committed the crime, blah, blah, blah. Finally, as a manipulation check, the participants were asked to indicate the alibis, witnesses, age, and relationship. So it literally goes through the entire thing from the time someone walked in the door to the time they leave. If it's a survey, you say the survey is presented in this way. These variable is measured with these questions. This variable is measured with these questions, right? Yes or no is, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about methods. Yes or no questions are very bad survey questions, and we'll talk about why that is. That is where you stop reading this paper. I mean, if you're interested in it, read the results and everything else, but your paper has no results in it. And I cannot stress that enough. There will be no results in your paper. And so ignore that. And then if your paper had results, there would be a discussion. But the discussion section is still kind of important to read if you wanted to. Also, by the way, people hate reading academic papers because there's numbers everywhere and it's kind of crazy. If you ever want to know the results and understand the results, all you have to do is take a marker and cross out the numbers, right? Just print out the paper and cross out the numbers for undergrads. I'm not suggesting this in graduate school, and this is not necessarily a common practice. You should learn the statistics, but if you're ever like, I just don't know what they're saying, it doesn't make any sense to me. If you remove the numbers, suddenly everything becomes not confusing anymore, right? There was a significant change between pre-alibi and post-alibi probability ratings overall. That's easy. That makes sense. There was also a significant two-way interaction between pre-alibi and post-alibi ratings and age. Ignore the numbers. Oh, okay, that makes sense, right? And so that's just a little tip for undergrads when they're reading academic papers. If you get super confused by the numbers, just ignore them. And it actually, the results section becomes pretty straightforward at that point. So anyway, you'll see here that what Laura and Heather do is they take their results and they tie it back into the larger literature. Again, the base of the martini glass, and it goes boom, real quickly. Here you spend a lot of time justifying your study, justify. Here you don't need to. You've done the study now. Here's why the study matters. For you guys, right, this is all kind of guesses as to why your study will matter. However, your study has implications no matter what for both sides. Let's say Heather found out that older alibi suspects, or I'm sorry, older alibi corroborators are more credible than younger alibi corroborators, right? Then the implication is it might be better in a case if you can to focus your attention and your defense on your older alibi suspects. Potentially the opposite is true, though, right? And in fact, this paper kind of suggests the opposite is true. Younger alibi corroborators are viewed as more credible. Well, if that's the case, then we need to focus on trying to find younger alibi corroborators because they're viewed as more credible to me, right? And so in general, your study has two ways it could go. It could be, right, and even in horrific studies, right? Like let's say that there's a study that suggests, or you're trying to do a study that suggests something like tighter gun control will reduce school shootings, right? That's a very kind of emotionally heavy topic. It could be that you do your research and you find out that, in fact, yes, tighter gun control would reduce school shootings. And there's implications of that. Therefore, we should push for tighter gun control laws. It also could be, though, that tighter gun control does not reduce school shootings, in which case trying to tighten down gun control laws is a waste of time and not actually going to do anything to help. So the implication is we need to come up with different ways to try and reduce school shootings, and maybe things like, situational crime prevention and crime prevention through environmental design will deflect some of this stuff away from schools as opposed to some big legislative statewide fix. And again, I'm not advocating for a policy one way or the other. That's just an example where it's like, oh, I don't really love the policy implication, but that could be an implication of this research project. This section, the implication section, is only going to be about a page, but the real thrust of that is to say, here's what my research could give to society. Here's why it matters. Here's why you should fund it. Here's why I should do it. There needs to be a reason to do it, not just like, oh, that was neato. Thank God I did that thing, right? So that's kind of the basic overall outline of what your paper should be. Now, one thing I am going to point out to you here pretty heavily is you'll notice in Heather's lit review, right? She has multiple citations of different people in the same paragraphs, right? One really, really bad thing that undergrads tend to do, you've seen that now, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. That undergrads tend to do is focus on one article and say, in this article, this happened, in this article, this happened, in this article, this happened. That's not particularly interesting, because if I want to know what happened in that article, I would just go read that article, right? Your summary of the article doesn't really do anything for me. And as you get higher up in the fields, right? I'm currently editing a book on alibi corroboration with a co-editor of mine up in Tennessee, and it is going to be a state of the science on alibi corroboration. I've more or less read everything there is in the legal psych field on alibi corroboration. So I don't need a summary of the article because I know what the article says. I want to know how you're using the literature to structure your argument so I can evaluate, is that a good argument or a bad argument? That's what you guys need to do. Structure your arguments in a way that actually make a point. Don't throw a citation in there to just be like, oh, neato, here's a study on alibis. I know it has nothing to do with what the research question is, but alibis in the title, so we should study it, right? That's not actually helpful. And in fact, in most academic writing, you get all of that crossed out and told to throw it out of your paper, because it seems like you're just adding fluff. And that's what we want to avoid. I would rather you turn in an 11-page paper that has a really strong argument to it and is a really focused argument than a 15-page paper that has a bunch of nonsense in it that's not relevant, right? And so now, granted, with that being said, please don't turn an 11-page paper and be like, oh, you said it was fine, and you have no argument throughout either, because you'll lose a lot of points for that. But if you make a good, compelling argument, I'm okay with the shorter paper. So with that being said, you need to make sure you're synthesizing the literature. So here's 3 articles on witnesses, and they make 3 different points, right? We know that older eyewitnesses are more credible than younger eyewitnesses. We know that relatives are less credible than strangers, and we know that how close you are to the suspect proximally, like in actual space and time, affects your credibility. If I see someone from way over there, I'm not viewed as credible as if someone's close. And so because of all of these things, blah, 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 right? And then you make your point and you make your argument. I've got 3 different studies with 3 different citations in even the same sentence at that point, making a point that because of that, we want to measure if age, proximity, and relationship are related to this phenomenon that's taking place. So it's going to take a little bit of work for you, and it's going to be a little bit more cognitively demanding than if you just said, here's a summary, here's a summary, here's a summary. And in your outlines, it looked like some of you just had summaries listed, and that was a bit concerning to me as well. I understand that this is hard. I understand this is complicated. I also understand that a lot of people have a really hard time finding research articles. And if that is the case, please, please, please ask for Caitlin Tralcom in the library. She is phenomenal. Any of the librarians can help you out, honestly. We have very good research librarians at Flagler, and you should really use them to help you find articles that are related to your topic or teach you how to use the search engines that are relevant. You should have gotten quite a bit of that in research methods, and if you didn't, or if you still are unclear, I'm obviously available to help you as well. But truthfully, the research librarians know more about it than I do and would be a much better resource for you than even I would. And I have no problem singing their praises and admitting that they're way better at me than probably most things in this world. So with that being said, that's kind of a general overview of the whole paper. So maybe tweak your outlines a little bit. And then as you're working on your intro and your literature review, make sure to go back and look at the rubric and make sure you're doing the right things. And also make sure that you are making an argument and kind of telling a story about what you hope to accomplish in this paper. So with that being said, again, with any questions you have, any concerns, please let me know. I'm always happy to help. Yeah, I'm available virtually anytime. All right. So thank you so much. And I will talk to you guys soon. And I'll post another one of these videos about the methods section and again about the implication section when those times come. For now, I want you really, really focused on the intro and lit review though. Okay. So with that being said, I will talk to you all soon.